We go. We're starting a really fascinating topic. I had something which I've actually written about and like to just share a little bit about this perspective. So I think I can speak for a lot of people is that if we go back to our school curriculum and we ask ourselves how much Tanach were we being taught in school, it's not so good. And by the way, as we move towards the men's side, very little. The women's side a significant amount more, but like in general, it seems to be that Tanach was left behind. It did not make it to the curriculum. And I'm just curious. I'd like to spend a little bit of time in learning today as to why that is, what happened to it, where it went, and where it came back. Because there's I think it tells an incredible story. I'd like to learn with you today. So let's just start. What I did was actually I reached out. We have 12 high school yeshivas in our neighborhood, so I reached out to all of them and asked them about their curriculum in Nach. And interestingly enough, out of the 12, 7 had formal programs. 5 had no program for Tanach whatsoever. And interestingly enough, they were all boys' schools from the more right-wing side of town, which don't have like zero Tanach, like meaning zero, nothing whatsoever. In Tanach, and it's interesting if you go back, you look at the schools already in Nach. Torah kind of features in the earlier grades and then disappears altogether. But
Parsha, they don't even.
Parsha disappears around middle school, and even I just went to my son's 7th grade siyum just 2 weeks ago. They finished the Gemara Makos. And the Rebbe got up there and said, we made a siyum on this and this and this, and he went through all the incredible things that they did through, and he says, and we got through one pasuk in Shmuel. That was the thing. That was that they started Shmuel and they got through one pasuk. And no theories yet, no theories, because there's a lot of theories. But I just anecdotally, I think we all appreciate that there's something missing, right? And so the question is, it seems to be it's not just a New York thing, it's not just a Five Towns thing, it seems to be as you go everywhere, this seems to be the thing, and the boys have it more heavily weighted less. Girls, it seems to be in the absence of Gemara and Mishnah, it seems to be that Tanakh becomes the thing, so there is an element of Tanakh. But the question is why is that? But more than that, what's interesting is that informally, it seems to be there's a resurgence of Tanakh, meaning to say, we see an incredible amount of rebirth of Tanakh learning outside of the school curricula, which is fascinating. What was that?
Thursday morning.
Yeah, Be'ezras Hashem. We're trying to supplement that. We're trying to re-educate ourselves. But here's an example. So take a look at over here. This is a description in 1922 when Rav Kook wanted to set up the yeshiva course, which was going to be called Merkaz Ha'olami, which was going to be the center of Torah study for the world, a very ambitious plan. So he set his student, Rav Cohen, to set up the curriculum, and here's what it's described. He proposed an astoundingly ambitious and wildly eclectic 6-year curriculum featuring numerous and extraordinary departures from the traditional yeshiva curricula, such as the Bible, Semitic languages, biblical criticism, history, exhaustive study of Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah from all periods, the fields Cohen sought to invent, such as Hebrew logic. Meaning to say, that was the plan for what we know today as Merkaz Harav. It didn't turn into quite as ambitious a scale, but that was where it started. And if you look at many of the yeshivot Hester today, there's incredible, not just Tanakh curricula, but there is also incredible Tanakh teachers of the greatest level today. But even online, in the online learning, so I just put in a few things over here. Take a look at this. This is Machon Herzog. If anybody's ever spent any time on Machon Herzog, it's unbelievable what they have going on. You can go to any chapter in Tanakh there, and they'll have multiple tiers of common day, recent day Mefarshim, like people who are commenting on it, maps, artifacts, it's all there. It's all connected on the Machon Herzog for every chapter in Tanakh. It's unbelievable. Go to Aleph Beta. Aleph Beta is more focused around Torah, but they do have a few courses on Nevi'im, and a lot of the Torah is related to Nevi'im, because that's the way that methodology Rav Foreman uses of intertextuality. In Israel, even in the non-religious sector, there's a whole section of Batei Medrash called the Mabua program. Just in their own words, in Mabua, young adults delve deep into Jewish texts and Western classics. For 4 months, they learn intensively, gaining new knowledge and learning tools along with much more. The understanding of Judaism and Israel evolves and deepens. So too does their understanding of themselves. This is a secular. This is a non-religious program, very much involved, and Tanach is very much part of their curricula as well. You go further as well. If you look at the IBM, which is VBM, which is the virtual base medrash of Gush of Har Etzion. I mean, there's an incredible amount of Nach there. On the non-denominational side, there's 929. Machon Herzog was a religious version of 929. 929 is of course the number of chapters in Tanach. There's a large program in Hebrew and English. It's a little controversial because they give a significant amount of platforming to Reform and Conservative as much more than Orthodox. The Orthodox have to apologize to squeeze onto that. But it is an incredible platform for the learning of Nach. The problem is, unfortunately, that a lot of people on that platform don't have the basic Ikra Emunah. So there's biblical criticism on there as well. But there's a lot of it's an incredible program, a daily program of learning of Nach, which exists in Hebrew and English. As well, there's Nach Daily. A friend of mine who just actually finished publishing his books. And then if you look at just the publications themselves, so we now have the entire set of Dat Mikra, which is a 40-year project to produce. We have in the Steinsaltz Tanach. We have also in Koren. If you see what's going on in Koren, it's unbelievable. They are now, besides having the larger the Magid books, which are with different authors across Tanakh on a great, incredible depth on each book of Tanakh, they're now also releasing what's called the Land of Israel series. It's unbelievable. They haven't got to Yoshua yet. They've just released Shoftim. It's interesting because it's artifacts, history, maps, everything that you can imagine in terms of like what actually happened. So they've released the 5 books of the Torah and they just finished Shoftim, which of course includes Rus in it as well. Sorry, Megillas Rus because it's the same time period. I begged them to give me the Sefer Yoshua because I've just started this recently. They said, no, the manuscript's not being released yet. But that will be coming out soon. There's so much going on. And then, of course, there's just a little plug over here. There is the Tanach Yomi app, which I released, which has many people using it. Should have many thousands more, but you have to pay to advertise. So nonetheless, that's out there as well as one of the tools. The only English site.
The girls at Shalom are.
There we go. I'm happy. There's many girls at Shalom who've been contacting me as they make their siyums. Baruch Hashem. You can in 10 minutes a day learn through all of the 742 chapters in Nach and every aliyah in the Torah. Thank you so much for joining what we created. And then today the Chidon Tanach is unbelievable. In our shul, we have somebody who made it to the final round as an adult, Adina Saperstein. If you just want to ask her about her experiences, just last year, there's a lot of really amazing things going. There has been an informal resurgence, and some schools in the modern Orthodox and certainly in the conservative movement. The conservative movement has the Solomon Schechter schooling systems. Generally speaking, when you're in Reform, you're in public school or private school, like other private schools, nothing to do with Judaism per se, so it's not, you can't really look at their school curriculum. But when you look at the Orthodox, in the modern Orthodox school curriculum, it seems that Nach has returned to some degree. And the question is, what level of learning is it really? Meaning what level of intensity? Unfortunately, we're watering down our education system, so it's sometimes harder to see. But in the yeshivish system, it's not yet penetrated at all. And so just the interesting thing which I'd like to ask is can we track learning Nach, its drop off and its resurgence? Like meaning what happened for it to disappear, what happened to it to reappear? That's my question. And I wrote a long essay on this topic, which Bezra Hashem hopefully will be published soon. But I want to just track a little bit of this. We're like going through the stages of we'll call post Tanach. In times of Gemara, Mishnah Gemara, times of the Rishon and the times of the Achronim, and then try to understand, put it together a theory. So here is as an offering, which and I think we've all heard of some of these ideas, but not all of them. Certainly, as well after doing a little bit of this. So the first thing to realize is that what was the study of Tanakh like during Nach, right? Like meaning we don't think about that so much, but like during the period of Nach. So how did people know what the word of God was? They spoke to the Messiah, but they also spoke to the prophets, right? Meaning, to a large degree, that you would speak to the prophets, and you had the earlier books, right? So, as an example, when let's say Shmuel, Shmuel wrote the book of Shoftim as well. So we had a book of the earlier period of 400 years before him that he wrote. So we had that as a way to understand what was going. Yoshua wrote his book, and Shmuel finished off the last little part where he died. But we have the books that were written as sequentially, sort of like the series being released, you know? So they were still living it. At a certain point, the book stopped being released. The way it's described in Seder Olam, which is Seder Olam is we'll call it the timeline medrash of that we have, Seder Olam Rabbah. It has 32 chapters. The end of the 30th chapter is, until that time, the prophets were prophesying with divine inspiration. From onwards, turn your ear, hatos necha, and listen and hear the words of sages. Which means we moved from an era of nevuah to an era of chachma. Chachma is I don't speak to God. God doesn't speak to me. I do speak to God. I speak to God in prayer, but God does not speak to me articulately, explicitly anymore. I have to try to figure it out through His Torah as to what to do, and therefore the sages are there to try to figure out what it is Hashem wants from us at this period in time. So this is a seismic change. When did that happen? When was the end of the era of prophecy and the beginning of the age of Chachma? Roughly? So the last prophet was the prophets were Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Malachi being the time of Ezra, according to one opinion, the Gemara being Ezra himself. So we talk about 2,500 years ago. So the period of Chachma started 2,500 years ago. The period of Nevuah ended at that point in time. At such point in time, now we're in the stage of Chachma. One would imagine at that point in time, there's no reason to believe otherwise, is that clearly once Tanach was canonized meaning it was the corpus of material was closed, then people were studying it, right? Because that's the only book they had. They had the Masorah, like Baruch was saying, which was the oral Torah tradition, which was continually be transmitted. But at that point in time, we had the book, and that was the book we studied, which makes a lot of sense as well. And in fact, even as the Mishnah and the Gemara are codified, and which happens in the year 200 and the year 500 respectively, so we're talking about 700 years and 1,000 years after the closing of Tanakh. We do hear this. So as an example, in the Mishnah, which is today's Mishnah Yami, the Mishnah tells us at the end of the 5th parak of Pirkei Avos, Hu ha'yomer ben chamesh shanim lamikra, ben 10 shanim lemishnah. So that at 5 years old, a person needs to master Mikra. Mikra being at this point loosely translated is written text, right? Is that referring to only Torah or Torah plus, like which is Nach? Not abundantly clear, but a person should, at the age of 5, be starting to learn Mikra, and then only in Esther the Mishnah. Then only at the age of 10 do they start learning the Torah Shabbat Peh, which is the Mishnah. When I grew up in the school I was at, I was in a unique school called Hirsch Lions, and the principal based was the wife of the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Gedola of Johannesburg, said that that's what they're going to do, and that's what they did. So they taught us Tanach. They taught us Torah. It was primarily Torah at that time, before we were allowed to learn Mishnah. Meaning they wanted us to be proficient. How proficient we became at such an immature age, it's hard to know, but they wanted us to make sure that we finished all of Torah. We finished all of Torah long before we started Mishnah. And that was based on this idea. Whether that's the complexity of ideas, but it seems to be that it's not that there's a de-emphasis. In fact, it seems like the prerequisite of everything else is Mikra, right? So it seems very clear in the Mishnah there's no de-emphasis on learning of Tanakh, right? I mean, in fact, the Gemara when it describes this period, describes that a Chacham is Adif Minavi, the Gemara says about Basra, that we're in the stage of wisdom, not in the stage of Nevuah. But in terms of the actual, the way we relate to it, the Gemara says very specifically, a person should subdivide their learning time into 3 sections. The Gemara tells us in Kiddushin, source 5, Shlish b'Mikra, a third in Mikra, which is the written text, Shlish b'Mishnah, that is the Mishnayos, and Shlish b'Talmud, Talmud being the discussion, the interplay between Mishnayos as well. And so it's not easy to understand if the Shlish Shnosav are sequential. So like we say, okay, I hope Be'ezrat Hashem, that I have 90 years. So I'm going to do 30 years, 30 years. It doesn't sound like that's what it is. In fact, the Rambam Paskins this halakha is by saying that it's your daily curriculum, which means to say is the way you should do it is if, let's say, you have 2 hours of learning a day that you have available, divide that into thirds and make those thirds into each of that. Which means to say is as we call the emergence of the formalized Torah Shabbat Peh comes out, is there a de-emphasis on Tanakh? And the answer is no. There's no de-emphasis. It's Tanakh and, right? Meaning it just has to be that there has to be some sort of division of time, right? I'm learning my Tanakh, And then I also have to learn Mishnah and Gemara as it becomes more formalized. Right? So it seems very clear that in the times of the Gemara, it does not seem that there was a de-emphasis. It seems that people were with it, and in fact, if you listen to the average conversation of an Amora in the Gemara, they speak in psukim. Right? They speak in psukim. It becomes, psukha. They speak to people. That's the lingua franca of the Amoraim. So they certainly were learning their Nach at least. We'll call the educated class of Judaism. That seems to be very much part of this as well. We also have the mission, the famous halacha of that a person should be yashlim adam parashiyos ha'tzibur, that a person needs to read the Torah every week. We call that mission, that halacha shnai mikra ve'echad targum. That's somewhat more limited because it's only the of Tanach, right? The Torah of Tanach, but that is formalized into halacha as something which we do. So there doesn't seem.
The Gemara in Kedushin, I believe there's a Taisus there. Maybe
hang on for a second.
You're getting to it. Sorry.
Moish, I did over a year of research on this topic. This, in terms of at least at the times of the Gemara, at the times of the Mishnah, for the first 1,000 years after the Tanakh was sealed, it doesn't seem like anybody was de-emphasizing. It sounds like this is part of the regular curriculum. We see no reason to believe that there was a de-emphasis. Somebody was taking their foot off the gas of the learning of Tanakh. But we do see in the following 1,000 years, from the year 500 to the year 1500, which is the era of the Gaonim to the Rishonim, we do see that something has changed. And this is where it becomes more complex. And so, let me give you an example of a few people who comment on this particular topic. Here are some interesting comments. And these are some sources I believe most people have not seen. Besides the Ibn Ezra being, and we spent a little time learning about the Ibn Ezra a few months ago. Besides the Ibn Ezra being a prolific author on the Torah and many things, he also wrote poems. He wrote a long poem which is called Nesod Hesir Oni, and he's referring to his experience as he moved to northern Europe. So remember that Ibn Ezra is very much a Spanish commentator. He moves to the area of the Tosafos, northern France, Germany, and he is astounded by the difference in their learning curriculum. And in this, he writes this poem. You should really read the entire poem. I translated this section, but he says as follows. He's describing the French rabbi. Here's what he says in source 7. He says to those who are wayward, I am full of knowledge with Moed and Zraim. Yet the beginning of the weekly portion in his mouth is inadequate. With Nashim Nazik... sorry, I apologize. It's in two columns. It goes. He says to those who are wayward, I am full of knowledge with Moed and Zraim and with Nashim Nazikim. Yet the beginning of the weekly portion in his mouth is inadequate, which is understood by little children. So what is he saying? He's saying, I'm meaning all these great Gedolei Torah who are studying the Mishnah and the Gemara, yet they don't even know the Parsha, right? So Ibn Ezra is mocking the people who he is. Now remember, we did note when we learned a little bit about Ezra, he met Rabbeinu Tam, right? There was a conversation between Ibn Ezra and Rabbeinu Tam, which is a remarkable historical convergence of two schools of thought. But what he's saying is I'm not so impressed. He goes to Italy, he goes to France, and he says, I'm not so impressed with the amount of Mikra, the amount of Tanakh study which I'm seeing there. So meaning the Ibn Ezra is saying, describing the disappointment he has as well. This is a source from the son, Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher was a great German leader of the Jewish community. He fled upon the imprisonment of his Rebbe, the Maharam of Wittenberg, in Germany. He fled through France down to Toledo. He was welcomed in by the Rashba, Rav Shlomo ibn Aderes, and he became a teacher and a communal leader in Toledo, Spain. So he had the experience of seeing a little bit of the whole experience. And so his son, Rav Yehuda ben Asher, says the following. He says, you need to make time to learn the verse of the tension and explanation, since in my youth I did not learn it. Because I was not accustomed to learning it in Germany, I was not able to teach it here being Spain. Which means to say is that Rabbeinu Yehuda ben Asher was saying, in my German curriculum, in the Ashkenaz aspect of part of Europe, I was not afforded the opportunity of learning Tanakh. Something has happened in Europe. That's what it seems to be. And in Spain, it doesn't seem to be as affected, interestingly enough. That's what he's observing. Similarly, Profiat Duran, he was a Jew who lived in the 14th century. He was actually forcibly converted to Christianity. He escaped Spain. Spain was at that time in the 14th century was being governed by the Dominican friars, right? And so he was forcibly converted to Christianity. He then escaped Spain, returned to his Judaism, wrote prolifically about it, and he describes one of these things. He says, in this period I note that Jewish scholars, even the greatest among them, show great derision for biblical studies. It is enough for them to read the weekly portion, and still it is possible that you ask them about a particular verse and they will not know where it is. They consider the one who spends time doing biblical studies a fool. The Talmud is our mainstay. This disease is rampant in France and Germany in our generation, as it was in the preceding period, but the earlier generation, it was not so. So he's bemoaning the fact that in his travels, again, in France and Germany, there is a complete, well-called devolvement. There's not been in Tanach study as well. He's noting something which has changed as well. And the question is what did really change in that period? I'm going to throw out a few things of suggestions that people make about this. But again, I believe there's a great movement in history that's afoot. But here's some of the examples that are given. So Dr. Yeager was mentioning just a moment ago is that although the Gemara itself says that a person is shalish shlish mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud, so you should subdivide your time in your learning of Tanach and your learning of Mishnah and Gemara. Nonetheless, the Tosfos, which is Rabbeinu Tam, so we're talking height of Tosfos Academy, height of French juries, academies and teaching of Torah. Rabbeinu Tam says, no, not necessary. You know why? Because it says that you should learn Talmud all the time. Why? Because it's balul mikulam. It includes everything else itself. Meaning, if you were to be a proficient in Talmud, you're going to have everything else. Now, Rabbeinu Tam is not saying why he says this. He's not telling us the motivation behind this, but he says, and this seems to be what was done. It seems to be there was a de-emphasis placed on the learning of Tanach, and there was a greater emphasis placed on the learning of Talmud, which has included all of it. Just out of interest, in terms of statistically speaking, if you were to learn all the Gemara and know all the Psukim, because this is discussed on the Shulchan Aruch, the Shach brings this Rabbeinu Tam, based on the Ramah, if you were to learn all the Talmud and know all the Psukim in the Talmud, how much of a percentage of Tanakh will you have covered?
You said 33% last year.
So it's only 33%. So I mentioned this before, so I believe it's 6,000 of the 28,000. So no, I don't remember the exact numbers. I did this a little while back, but you will have reached less than a third of the benchmark of all of Tanakh just by learning Gemara, which is great. So apparently, the way it's generally understood is if you were to study Tanakh like Rabbeinu Tam did it, Talmud like Rabbeinu Tam did, then you would be alright. Meaning, if you were to really, every time you found a pasuk, you would open up the Tanakh and read the surrounding circumstances, then yes. Or, you might mean say that became your, then this comes back to all the jokes you have about the yeshiva students of today. They say, the yeshiva students today, they don't learn Tanakh. And they say, we do. They say, can I test you? He says, where does it say this pasuk? He says, Bava Metzia Dal Nun Gimel. Right? So that becomes the
Halavai, they could do that.
Halavai, they could even do that. Right? So that becomes the thing. I remember when I was in a more right-wing yeshiva, and I would try to do. I did Nach. I had to do it during Ben Astarim. Right? I did it in Erzos Noshim because it was pasnished, right? To do that. And when I did my Shnai Mikra on Fridays, the people came. I actually had somebody come over to me and saying like, "You should really learn," like that. So like, I mean, that's the way it works in the more right-wing yeshivas. But nonetheless, so I had to kind of fit it in my own time. I learned my Nach at 10:30 at night. That was when I'd finished my Siddur, and that's when I started re-educating myself as to what was missing. And in my lunch break, which I was, at 1:30 after lunch, before Mincha and afternoon Seder, that's when I started learning Nach, just to be able to maximize. That's in addition to 12 hours of the day, right? Meaning to say, right, that's what is going on the rest of the time. So you have to kind of fit it in. But that's Rabbeinu Tam's model over here. The question is why? Like, why? Is it because ideologically he said that no, it's all there and that's the way you should be doing it, or is there something else motivating him? So there happens to be, there's a Gemara which many people points to, and actually Dr. Mordechai Broya has an incredible essay on this particular topic, which is based on the Gemara which says, in Brachos, that it says, Omar Lahem, Rabbi Eliezer says, Hizaru bichvoid chaverchem umanu b'neichem in higayon. Don't teach your children higayon. What does that mean precisely? Rashi says an amazing thing. Rashi says, Loi targileim b'mikra yoser mishum demashcha. Don't teach them too much mikra, because it draws them away from Talmud. What's an amazing thing is because Rashi commented on all of Tanach. But nonetheless, he says, don't spend that as the major focus of your educational curriculum. It's going to take you away. And his grandchildren took that to a much further extent. Meaning Rabbeinu Tam was his grandson. Rabbeinu Tam was saying already. So, but it is interesting to note, I'd like to make this observation. And this is the observation that Dr. Mordechai Breuer makes in his essay on this particular topic, is that if you look at the interpretation of the Spanish interpreters of this Gemara, if you look at Rav Sadia Gaon, right, that's already Baghdad, right, the area in the Middle East, if you look at the predominant interpretations of the Spanish jury, they do not say it refers to Tanach. They say Mikra. They say it refers to philosophy, which is fascinating because clearly what's happening is as follows. In the stage of the medieval commentators, in the stage of the Rishonim, what they're essentially doing is like this. They're looking at the worrying problems of their time, right? And they're saying that this Gemara means that, right? You understand? I mean, the Gemara says, don't teach your children Higayon. Higayon literally means logic today in Hebrew, right? But what does that mean precisely, right? So the Ashkenazic jury interpreted this to mean, don't teach them too much Tanakh. Right? Whereas Sephardic jury in general, or Middle Eastern jury was saying, don't teach them too much philosophy. Philosophy in Spain was much more of a concern. Unfortunately in Europe, because of the dark ages of the church, right? People were not studying philosophy, right? So it was less of an issue. The Rambam, when you read, why was the Rambam writing more in Nevuchim? He read all of Aristotle in Arabic, right? Right. So meaning to say, philosophy was a major concern, and so therefore Manu ben Eichem Migayon turned to much more of that. The focus on Tanakh was not less of an issue. Why was Tanakh more of an issue in Europe? There's many academic arguments. One academic argument is because at this time there was a rise in biblical study in the Christian world, and you study of biblical learning as polemics, which means to say this became the rise of the great debates, of the stages of trying to disprove Judaism from Judaism itself. Right, so if you listen to this, like under even as the Iberian Peninsula became cleansed by the Christians right, so that debate the Ramban is forced to have in Aragon is a debate around Psukim in Tanakh, right? And people are starting to write, Christian scholars are starting to write about Tanakh. And therefore, in a certain sense, some people would even argue that Rashi and the rise of the Pashtanim is a response to the Christian polemics in the Torah itself. And therefore there's a desistance. Let's not spend so much time in this area itself. This is one of the academic arguments as to what's happening over here. And that's more of a European issue than it is a Spanish or Middle Eastern issue, which is why you're seeing this as well. Interesting enough, in Shulchan Aruch, if you look at that in your day, and the halachas of Talmud Torah, the Shulchan Aruch for Yosef Kara living in the Ottoman Empire and ultimately in Israel itself, part of the Ottoman Empire, paskins the Gemara, which based on the Rambam, La'olam Yeshalash Shnaisa, that a person should divide up their time a third. And he leaves it as such. The Ramah quotes Rabbeinu Tam saying, but Talmud is predominant based on Rabbeinu Tam. Where does the Ramah live? In Warsaw. Right, so European jury seems to have moved very much further away, whereas it seems to be that Sephardic jury did not seem to have the same denting, and this is one of the arguments which seems to be the case.
Doesn't that response seem counterintuitive? How do you then respond if you're ignorant?
You're right. No, you're right. So, by the way, I thank God that I was not having to make decisions. Meaning, like, thank God we weren't in the position of having to make decisions, because I understand there's casualties on all sides. There's casualties for engagement. There's casualties for disengagement. The question is in the sum total of Jewish education, which way is there going to be fewer casualties? Complete disengagement. Meaning to say, and therefore, when they talk about their Bibles, we're not getting involved. We're not discussing that. That's not the priority. Our focus is Talmud, which is what you don't have, right? Or no, we're going to fortify our kids to engage and lose as well. Which way has greater casualties? These are terrifying questions, and either way you lose, right? Either way you're going to lose. The question is, do you lose less? That's what's happening. By the way, fast forward. Let's hit the 1800s. The same question comes up again, but the higher stakes are even higher, right? So let's move into the next era. The next era is now moving from the 1500s, what we call the era of the Achronim, and we see it continues. If you look at the average yeshiva curriculum, This is based on an essay by Elchanan Reiner, he describes the yeshiva curriculum in the yeshiva setting in the last 500 years. He describes intended to train students to reach halachic decisions, that is to prepare them for the rabbinate, imparted principles of decision making according to the halachic traditions, and the third component of the yeshiva curriculum, the pilpul lesson of reasoning. So he's describing what was the predominant focus in yeshivas in that era, and the predominant focus is Talmud. I mean, there's three focuses over there. There's halachic decision making, right? Halachic traditions and pilpul. There's nothing about Nach in the curriculum at such stage as well. And in fact, Rav Avram Horowitz, who's the brother of the Shlah HaKodesh, makes observation, and this is now, we're talking in the 16th century in Lvov and Krakow. He says, even in our days and our sins, prophecy has ceased and vision has disappeared, and we have no prophets nor seer. In their absence, we have the words we are obliged to listen to them as the words of the living God. And even someone who spends all his life learning Torah, it is unimaginable that any corpus of learning should completely push aside Mikra, which is the Torah, prophets, and scriptures, from the beginning to the end, and to be an expert in them. For those who spend time in Pilpul, theorizing in Talmudic ideas, standing outside the gates of the king palace, it would be much better for them to switch and enter the innermost chambers of the palace and learn his word. So he's saying, I don't understand, this is already in the 16th century, I don't understand why the students in yeshiva are not learning God's word. You're learning the tradition of the sages, which is phenomenal, and that's an interpretation of God's word, but you're not learning God's word. Like, why are you not in the palace? So already this continues to be an issue specifically in Europe as well. And this becomes an issue till today. The question is, why is it? I mean, this continued all the way through the 1800s, the 1900s, where the yeshiva curriculum was absent of any study of Tanach. If you look back to Volozhin, right? If you look back to which was the mother of the modern day yeshivas as we have it today, the yeshiva system, absent in general of Nach. Why is this? There's a number of arguments which are given, and I'd like to say that they're small arguments, but they're important arguments. But he has a few of them. This is in an essay which was written in Chakira, I believe. Yeah, this is a Chakira where Maskin actually put this out. This is all surrounding a whole debate that happened in the early 1950s, where in Cleveland, Ohio, the Aguda and the Mizrahi celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut together. And then there was a whole uproar. Aguda, how could it be that Aguda celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut, right? And so in response to that, Rav Elimeir Bloch responded. He was the Rosh Hashiva of Telz in Cleveland. So he responded as to why it was, and then it was redacted. So his response was redacted because it wasn't appropriate. So this is a copy of the redacted part of his speech as to explaining his involvement and the concerns of involvement as well. He says the following: in general, I already expressed my view that we lost a great deal by refraining from recognizing correct issues just because the irreligious and those manipulated by them. The Mizrahi agreed to them because those agreeing with them, we would have strengthened their false opinions. Meaning to say like this: there's certain things in Judaism which are really important, but the irreligious took control of those issues, and therefore by aligning ourselves with those who strengthened those issues, it's almost like giving credence to the irreligious, right? Mizrahi is not the irreligious. Mizrahi made a decision to lean in to those issues and refortify them religiously. But the question is that the correct decision? In my opinion, our views did not find receptive hearts within the nation, not because of our stance against the incorrect views, rather it is because of our negative position against the correct views, such as learning of Bible, speaking Hebrew, and Eretz Yisrael. So he says there's three things which the irreligious, almost maybe a little more correct, the anti-religious adopted as their flag posts, and therefore, in a certain sense, the religious community had to take a few steps back from. And they are learning of Hebrew, learning of Tanach, and the land of Israel. And his observation is that why did the religious community step back, mostly, again, to say that the Olam HaTorah step back from Tanach is as if Mizrahi doesn't exist. But a certain section of the religious community stepped back from these issues. Why? Because the anti-religious adopted them. And therefore, in the 19th century, as the Reform movement arose, and as the Haskalah arose, and they adopted Hebrew as an academic study, Israel as secular Zionism, right, and Tanakh study as in the realm of academic study, then the religious community desisted more and more and more from their involvement in this as well. That's his argument as well, meaning three very important values which got completely underemphasized in Judaism. Why? Because of the social trends of the association with them. Very profound argument, which is unfortunately, and you can understand why it takes so much for Mizrahi to straddle that. But going further, Rav Sternbach in his Chus V'Anagos, who's the head of the Eida Charedis, points out, and I translated this, he says, someone who's already fulfilled themselves with the teachings of Talmud Halacha and a pure fear of God is certainly obligated to learn all the holy writings. So somebody asked him, should we learn Tanach? He said, absolutely, once you finish learning all of Talmud. He says, but for the uninitiated, our parents have refrained from this teaching in this recent era. One should not change this, so one should not re-emphasize Tanakh. He says, it is liable to create damage to teach the stories of our ancestors Tanakh, which may be misinterpreted without understanding there are much deeper secrets in the holy text. So what he's saying is like essentially as follows. We have so many detractors who spend so much time belittling Tanakh. And by the way, if you just read through academic criticism of Tanakh, the way, the tone, even if it's not criticism in terms of a documentary hypothesis, but just the tone of understanding Tanakh has been so belittling. He says what he's saying is that if you don't have the correct Yiras Shamayim before learning Tanakh, you're going to think that you have a seat at the table interpreting Tanakh, and you don't. You're not entitled to an opinion, right? But you're going to make the wrong decisions about learning this. So he says, therefore, in terms of academically, we should educationally take a step backwards. Make sure you got your Yiras Shamayim in place, and then learn Tanakh. And that seems to be the general approach of the Haredi world. Similarly, Rav Wozner in the Shevet HaLevi also was asked the same question, and he says, I do not need to spend my time explaining something that was clear to all Jewish leaders, meaning about learning of Tanakh. Just some of them hid their knowledge of Tanakh and knowledge of the intricacies of the text out of the concern that it would be a strength in the heretics who try to deface the Tanakh and its study, leading to further misinterpretation. But the inherent need of this section of the Holy Torah does not need my approbation. Meaning what the Rav Wozner is saying is like, you don't need me to explain why you need to learn Tanakh. He says the reason why people have publicly sort of desisted is because it seems to be that one group of Jews, the heretics, really took this as their thing and made it their MO. He says, but of course you need to learn Tanakh, but just maybe that will de-emphasize it. So it seems to me that there's many explanations as to the things that were called religious Judaism was struggling with throughout the centuries as to why it became less significant. However, I would like to argue that there's something much more profound afoot, and that's where we're up to now. And so, meaning all this said, it seems to be that since the closing of Tanakh, the first 1,000 years or so, it does not seem to be that there was a significant drop off, which makes sense. Right, they had the book of Tanakh and that tradition. The tradition was slowly being redacted into writing, and they had both, and they learned it, and it was part of their basic curriculum. In the following 1,000 years after that, we see a significant drop-off, specifically in European Jewry, and that continued to taper downwards, as not only were the non-Jews involved in Tanakh study, but the Jews themselves, many of them academic and heretical, Haskalah adopted it as a mainstay of their study, and then the religious community, in a certain sense, circled the wagons more and more and more to avoid these really important issues. And then there seems to be a resurgence recently, so it's almost like a U. I'd like to argue why is that? And this is an argument which I think is the most profound perspective, and that is as follows. Is that I believe that Judaism in a certain sense stepped out of history 1,800 years ago. What does it mean stepping out of history? Think about this for a second. The moment when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was negotiating with Vespasian on the outskirts of Jerusalem, remember, he'd feigned death, been brought out in a coffin, and now at this point in time he's negotiating with the Roman general who's going to soon be Caesar over the Roman Empire, and he's negotiating an exit plan for what is called the Prushim. The Prushim are the rabbinic students. And he says, Tainli Yavne v'chachomeh. One of the three requests he makes is not save Jerusalem, but let the chachomeh, let the sages exit Jerusalem. That's what happens. He manages to successfully navigate this. He brings the sages out, which means to say now there's, in a certain sense, this truce where the sages leave Jerusalem, and they don't leave Jerusalem empty. They leave it to all the warriors, all the soldiers. There's three different factions who control three different parts of Jerusalem, are killing each other in Jerusalem at this point in time. So just read Josephus. It's horrible. It's a very embarrassing stage in Jewish history, and in a certain sense, we write out the siege of Jerusalem out of our textbook. You notice that the Gemara does not talk about the siege of Jerusalem after the Biryonim burn the storehouses. Very little is described about that. There's no heroes in our curriculum from that era. Right? There are people, we don't know about them, like people by the name of Shimon ben Giora, Yochanan being Gush Chalav, John of Giskala. These are all famous people in the Jewish war, but we don't know about them. Why? Because in the Talmud, gone. Meaning, it's, in a certain sense, what happened was Judaism wasn't just leaving the siege of Jerusalem. They were leaving the stage of world history. They were saying, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, we are retreating. We're no longer going to fight. We're no longer going to have an army. We're no longer going to have a country. We are going to now be Roman subjects in Yavne, and we're going to continue quietly doing our peaceful thing called Torah study. That's what we're going to be doing now. And again, 60 years later, they tried again. 60 years later, the Roman edicts were becoming so harsh. Under Hadrian, it was a terrible time, and a fellow by the name of Bar Kokhba, Shimon Bar Kokhba, took upon himself to fight back against the Romans. A successful start to the process, and he reclaimed Jerusalem, reminted the coins, was trying to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and ultimately the Romans sent in 2 legions from Gaul, and they crushed it mercilessly. And if you read the stories, if you read the Roman historians of the time, Cassius Dio, and you read what they say about the blood that spilled across Israel at that time, it was worse than 60 years prior. This is year 130 to 135 Common Era. And what was sad about this period in time was not just the fall of Beitar, and that was the last Jewish sovereignty from the year 135 to the year 1948, where Jews had sovereignty over the land of Israel. But in a certain sense, think about what happened philosophically. This is an observation I just heard recently from Tarmir Granot. I think it's an unbelievable insight. He said, when the people were fighting in Jerusalem and the Jews were killing each other, sectarianism, and there was sinas chinam, that's the Gemara describes, sectarianism, you could say to yourself, why did Jerusalem fall? Because Jews were fighting with each other. And this was not given the license by the sages. But when Beitar fell, 65 years later, to the troops, to the Roman troops, at that point in time, they were condoned by the rabbis. Rabbi Akiva, in fact, bore arms for Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva believed he was the Messiah, right? There was no Jews fighting among each other. This was the effort, and it was crushed mercilessly. So in a certain sense, at that point in time, that was the final nail in the coffin, where Judaism said, we are no longer going to engage in the world. We're going to recede from the world of geopolitics. And Judaism, for 1,800 years, lived as a subculture in somebody else's culture. Judaism never had political power from 135 to 1948. And if you think about this, it's a remarkable description. This is as described in the Vilna Gaon in Safra Tzniusa. The Vilna Gaon describes the process of Galus being as follows. He says, from the time the temple was destroyed in source 21, our spirit and crown left. We remained a body without a soul. Ancient diaspora was entering the grave, surrounded by decay, and no recourse against the Gentiles to eat our flesh. But there were still communities and large academies, until the flesh rotted and the bones were dismembered and scattered again and again. But the bones still remained intact, because there were sages in Israel who held together the parts of the body, until the body as well faded, and all that was left was dust. Our souls in that dust, and we now can only hope for the resurrection of the dead. Wake up from the dust and stand up. Kumi. What he's saying is like this, is that when the description of the dry bones, this is what he's commenting on, in Yechezkel, in Perek Lamed Zayin, what he's saying is we're talking about communal structure. The body was the nation. And as the nation dies, that means our national trappings die. And as the bones dismember, that means that the parts of our communal structure, meaning as Jews start now moving away, and they're no longer just in centralized Middle East, and there's no longer rabbinic centralization, now they move to Spain and Europe, and then traditions start developing and disappearing, and now people then exile after exile after exile, there's nothing left. There's no communal structure, there's no political structure in the same way. We're now, in a certain sense, somebody in somebody else's garden. We're retreated to the realm of what's called the Darat Amma Shel Halacha, which means, what did Judaism do? Judaism said we're going to do the 2 things which always work, which is study of Torah and Tefillah. Those are the only things we're going to do. To be involved in politics, to be involved in military, that's not something we do anymore. In fact, in a book written by Ruth Wise, which is excellent, it's called Jews in Power, she writes the following. She says, only after exile did the religious interests gain exclusive control, so that Judaism ceased to be the constitution for a state and become a religion in the usual sense of the word. What she means to say is that Judaism used to be a nation, and then it became a religion. And a religion does not have a flag. Religion does not have a country. Religion does not have an army. Because that was a decision that was specifically made as we retreated into ourselves. for the last 1800 years. In the ways written by Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, of course, was no friend to the Jews. He left Judaism, but listen to his observation. One of the reasons he left Judaism, he says it in his treatise. He says the following: but with regard to the ceremonial observances which were ordained in the Old Testament for the Hebrews only, and were so adapted to their state that they could, for the most part, only be observed by the society as a whole and not by each individual, it is evident that they form no part of the divine law and had nothing to do with the blessedness and virtue, but in reference only to the election of the Hebrews, that is, to their temporary bodily happiness and tranquility of their kingdom, and therefore they were only valid while that kingdom lasted. Which means, what he's saying, and this is heresy, okay, this is how he curses, what he's saying is as follows: is most of Judaism is relating to Judaism as it lives in the land of Israel when they have a kingdom. And therefore, when that kingdom ended, so did Judaism. That's what he's essentially saying. And by the way, you can imagine why Jews would think this. Because what is left? Most of the mitzvahs of the Torah we cannot do. Most of the mitzvahs of the Torah are around a society, not a Jew living in New York or in Baghdad or in Tripoli. It is about living as a nation. And in a certain sense, we put on hold nationhood for the last 1800 years because we couldn't do it. It was an act of saving Judaism, which is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was doing, Rabbi Akiva was doing after him, as we contracted into the Dalad Amas Shel Halacha. And that has been the case for the last 1800 years. And then something happened in the 1900s. And the 1800s, the 1900s, the 19th century. Suddenly, God started acting again in history in a way that we'd never seen beforehand. Suddenly nationalism rose. Suddenly Jews started wanting to go back. Secular Jews suddenly awakened and said, we want to go back to the land of Israel. Suddenly, a language which was dead from usage on a regular basis, not Ladino, not Yiddish, which was at its height at that point in time, but Hebrew started arriving again. And some people started saying, let's learn back to our country. This is this resurgence of this language. And at that point in time, one asks oneself the question is God speaking again? Is this something that is of significance? One part of the Jewish community said, no. We're going to continue doing what we're doing until Hashem brings Mashiach, right? Nothing has changed. Another part of the religious community said, wait a second, maybe God's speaking to us. Maybe there's a role through the secular process. Maybe something's happening. At this moment in time, I would say that Judaism is starting to step back into history again, as a player on the international field again. Listen to the words of Bialik. He wrote a poem. It's a terrifying poem. It's called The City of Slaughter. Does anybody know why he wrote it? The 1903 Kishinev program. And at the end of the poem, it's very terrible. It's a terrible poem. And he's attacking the religious Jews. And he says the following. He says, one showed a wounded arm and one a fracture bears. This is after a pogrom. And all have eyes that are eyes of the slaves. Slaves flogged before their masters, and each one begs and each one craves, reward me, my master, for my scroll is broken. Reward me for my father who was martyred. He's describing the shilas they were asking. This woman was raped. Is she allowed to remarry her husband? And he's describing all these descriptions of what would happen after a pogrom. And then he turns to them and he says, rise to the desert fee, a cup of affliction thither bear thee with thee. Talc thy soul, rend in many a shred, with impotent rage thy heart deform, thy tear upon the barren boulders shed, and send thy bitter cry into the storm. He's turning to them and saying, why are you not doing anything? Why, as a diaspora Jew, do you just take another beating and just martyr another person and go back to your life and pretend that it's not going to happen again, and then the drunkard Russian Cossacks are not going to come once more to murder you, and all you just do is just put your head down and bear it? Because that's what Jews did this whole time, because they had no recourse, because there was no one. And he says, why no longer? And I think about now, fast forward 100 years, Jews standing up for themselves and killing those who come to kill those who come to kill them. Think about that change as what's happened. That's what Bialik was talking about. Is Judaism? We're no longer stuck in the backwaters of Europe. That's what has changed in the last century. The last century has been the return to the national stage again. And let's just a few examples. In the Declaration of Israel's Independence, by the way, we have it in the library upstairs. If you go to the second tier on the left there, Eric Amanoff donated it. It's worthwhile reading. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration for the ingathering of exiles. It will foster the development of the country to the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. Meaning, as secular as they were, they realized that we're returning to the prophets of Israel. Right? We're turned, and what, in a certain sense, here's my argument. This is my argument. I'd like to give you examples of this. Is as Judaism ceased to be a nation and turned into a religion, and as Judaism contracted to within itself to survive throughout the waves of terrible history, where we had no way to protect ourselves but to make ourselves as favorable to and find grace in the disenfranchised existence that we lived in a diaspora reality. As we continued to do that for all of those years, we didn't need Tanach anymore because Tanach spoke a language which was foreign to our existence. Meaning the idea of reading about kings, the idea of reading about armies, the idea about reading cultivating countries. All that language, in a certain sense, was something completely foreign to the Nebuch, the Yiddish Jew, living in the ghetto, who was trying to drag water to get a few kopecks to be able to put food on the table that day before the latest draft in the army. That was not, Tanakh wasn't, right? It wasn't speaking to that reality. It wasn't speaking to the reality of the disenfranchised Jew. And in a certain sense, Tanakh, the lack of Tanakh, with all the other explanations, with respect given to them, in a certain sense, what was happening was the downturn, not just of nationhood, but the language of nationhood, which is found in Tanakh. But now, as the resurgence happens, as Jews now start returning, and the language is reborn, and the land is reborn, and Jews can stand up for themselves once again, and there's an army, and there's a country, in a certain sense, we need a language that expresses that. Which is why the secular Jews turn to Tanakh, right? Meaning, here is a book which talks about our history, the book of books. It talks about us as soldiers, us as players in the geopolitical scene in the Middle East, us as people who have morals among the heathens around us, us as this is the language we can now start talking. That's why the very Declaration of Independence references the prophets as well. In fact, that's what Yechezkel is saying. Is if you go back to the Vilna Gaon's description of the bones and the communal structure disintegrating, then think about how Yechezkel describes the people who are expressing, who are reflected, or the metaphor of these communities are saying we've lost our hope, we've been cut off, meaning they're saying Judaism is no longer. Say to those diaspora Jews, I'm opening up your graves and bringing back the disintegrated parts of your communities back to the land of Israel. Notice, by the way, that language was where Naftali Tehertz Imber used it to create the national anthem of Israel. Right? That these people, the disintegrated communities of Israel, says Avda tikvaseinu nigzarnu lach, and that is, when you get to the high part, is Oid loy Avda tikvaseinu. He was taking it directly from this prophecy of Yechezkel, meaning even not just the Declaration of Independence references the prophets, the national anthem of Israel is based on this prophecy of Yechezkel of the resurgence of Oid loy Avda tikvaseinu. That's where it comes from. Is this idea? Meaning the building of national language is built on. The prophet itself. Consider taken as an example. It gives us the language to understand what we're going through. So let's take an example. Let's say you think about Israel, and the nation of Israel is exiled from their land. The superpower in the Middle East controls the area. And the government allows the Jews to migrate to Israel and establish a homeland. Most Jews do not pick up and leave immediately, and so there are a few waves of Aliyah which are sent in small numbers. Upon arrival, local inhabitants, many of whom are recent immigrants to the land, claim the rights to the land. When they are not included in the rebuilding of the Jewish homeland, they begin political agitation with the superpower. They succeed in slowing down the building, and when that is not successful, they turn to violence, forcing the Jewish inhabitants to split between defending themselves and building. That sounds like such an incredible description of the last century, right? But that's not the only time it happened. It happened another time in the book of Ezra. The same exact pattern. Meaning, that's everything described here, word for word, is what happened in Sefer Ezra. If we were to learn Sefer Ezra again, we would be able to have a map to understand what's going on now with the so-called Palestinians, with how to navigate a superpower controlling the area, navigating the politics and the diplomacy. All of that happened already. We don't need to understand how to do it now because it did happen. It already, meaning the format of what we're going through right now has been described in Tanakh. It's all there. This happens so many times. In fact, listen to this pasuk in Nehemiah. The pasuk in Nehemiah says, "Vayhi min hayom hahu chatzi narei osim hamalacha v'chatzi machzik v'rachim v'maginim." At that point in time, we could no longer spend all our effort building. We had to spend half the people doing guard duty and half the people building. Think about how much of Israel's GDP is spent on defense. Much higher than any other regular nation in terms of percentages. Unbelievable. Why? It continues to be, which means to say that's the reality we're living with. A few last examples, we'll close this. Just to understand why the language of Tanach speaks the reality that we're living with today as well. Civil war, right? So just before October 7th, there was terrible amount of attrition internally, right? There were marches in Tel Aviv on Saturday nights with hundreds of thousands of people. And by the way, unfortunately, it's coming back with just in a different form right now, unfortunately, not to the same level. But the civil war. How do you deal with Jews fighting Jews? Go to the end of Sefer Shoftim. Read about Pilegesh Begiva. Read about the ideas where one tribe thinks another tribe does not have the license to make its own laws. That tribe had to be Binyamin, by the way. And how Jews killed each other in the times of Asa, where 500,000 Jews died in civil war against each other, the northern and the southern kingdom, at the beginning of that time. It's all there. Meaning that those are things you didn't talk about in the shtetl in Vilna, right? You didn't. This is what we're talking about right now. Corruption of power. Think about this for a moment. We're talking about corruption. There's a whole thing going on now. Trump is saying, let Bibi go, and the whole business is all happening right now as we speak. The idea of a king having oversight, right? A politician having oversight. Is it right? Is it not? Is it witch hunt? Is it not witch hunt? But this is a very, very common theme in Tanakh. It happens many, many times. One classic example is when there's a king, Yoash, who's saved by Yehoiada. Yehoiada is there's division of powers, right? Yehoiada is the Kohen Gadol. He saves the king. He develops the king, cultivates the king. The king becomes a great king. Yehoiada, the Kohen, dies, and his son Zechariah takes his place. Zechariah is the Kohen Gadol. And Yoash starts becoming very, very infatuated by himself because of some of his advisors. And on Yom Kippur, Zechariah gives a drasha in the Beis Hamikdash about the way that society is going, and they didn't like what he said, so the king's men killed him in the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur, right? And we read about this on Tisha B'Av because his blood was boiling till the times of Uzadron, right? But you want to go visit his kever? It's down in the Kidron Valley. If you want to go see, you go down the Yad Zechariah. That's where Zechariah is buried, right next to Avshalom, right over there. You can go visit Yad Zechariah today. Just don't do it at night in the Kidron Valley. But again, the ideas of religious oversight to political leadership. Right, Repamati. That's something which has been talked about beforehand. Civilian casualties. Right, today we're talking about civilian casualties. How could it be Israel is doing this? Well, they're trying to fight against people living underneath civilians. Every single hospital, every single school is occupied underneath it by the headquarters of Hamas agents. This is not a new thing. When David Melech wanted to capture Yerushalayim, it describes that the Yevusi, the Jebusites, placed Ivrim and Pischim on the ramparts of Yerushalayim. What does that mean? There's a major machlokes in the Rishonim as to what that means. The most basic understanding is Ivrim and Pischim means the blind and the lame. What they did was they put their weakest on the ramparts so David HaMelech could not conquer the city of Jerusalem. And David HaMelech had to make a decision. Is the military objective going to be achieved even though there's going to be civilian casualties? These are not new topics that we're discussing. These all come from Tanakh as well. Mercy on the cruel. We know that famously that Sinwar was one of those who was Machsham of Zikra, was one of those who was traded back in one of the terrorist deals, right, a number of years ago. Now again, yes, it's very important to get back Gilad Shalit, and it's who can speak about those terrible decisions, the political pressure which the stupid Jews put on themselves to ratchet up the prices. But nonetheless, if you in the end of the day, they sent back Sinwar, and he created October 7th. But that's not a new topic. That happens again, right? Agag is spared by Shaul, and it's all for good reasons, but at the end of the day, he begets Haman HaRasha. Meaning all these topics that talk about what we're dealing with now are all in Tanakh. We just need to learn it. But my point is as follows. That fell away when our existence of nationhood disappeared for these 1800 years. And now as it rises again, it's the place and it's the forum which gives language and expression to the realities we're dealing with as well. I close with the words of two opposing prime ministers of Israel. The first prime minister and his head opposition, David Ben Gurion and Menachem Begin. in the words of Menachem Begin, we are granted the right to exist by the God of our fathers at the glimmer of the dawn of human civilization nearly 4,000 years ago. For that right, which has been sanctified in Jewish blood from generation to generation, we have paid a price unexampled in the annals of the nations. What he's saying is like this, I'll tell you why I have the right to fight. Because the Torah says so. Right? Because the Torah allowed me. I'm connected to Israel. I'm not a Holocaust survivor. I'm a Jew from Sinai. That's who I am. And because I read that book, what he used to call, he used to have a Tanach Chabur at Surah Shlishis in his house. What did he call it? The Book of Books. He would always quote the Book of Books, Menachem Begin. That informed his thinking. He had a Tanach Chabur with great intellectuals of the time every Shabbos afternoon. That would be his discussion. And even David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, says, since I invoke Torah so often, let me state that I do not personally believe in the God it postulates. Oh, by the way, we could debate it based on some of his actions. But nonetheless, we'll let him say what he has to say. I'm not religious, nor were the majority of the early builders of the Israel believers. Yet their passion for this land stemmed from the Book of Books. The Bible is the single most important book in my life. Spoken by a person who claims he does not believe in it. But why is it so important? Is because it gives him the language to do what he's doing. And therefore I believe that the learning of Tanakh tracks the existence of the Jewish people. And as it disappears in a certain sense, it's tracking a nation which is subsiding away from existence and just surviving on its core values, which have, thank God, have allowed us to come back to this point. But now it's expanding again. And as it expands, the language of nationhood comes, and that is Tanakh. Thank you everybody for coming.